Okay, can I now introduce Professor Cameron Monroe?
Well, thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you for including me, and Arthur, thank you for agreeing to chair this session. Today we are all here trying to think constructively about Bristol's role in the transatlantic slave trade and how best to discuss that history. These are all obviously issues that go well beyond Bristol. They encapsulate cities and communities all around the Atlantic world. My own experience as an archaeologist, I think, lends a slightly different perspective to some of the folks talking tonight. And I'm going to talk a bit from my experience as one working on the archaeology of West African kingdoms who were involved in the slave trade. I've been asked to talk a bit about the history of West Africa's involvement in the slave trade tonight to give some broader context to what we're all talking about. And again, I have to forgive you. I'm not a historian of Bristol. I'm not even a historian of Great Britain. So what I have to say comes from a much different perspective. I know nothing about the Colston debate, for example. So I'm learning quite a bit as I sit here listening to this tonight. Something I'd like to do before launching into just a bit of the history of the slave trade in West Africa is pull out some key ideas that I think shape most discussions about how we talk about slavery and the slave trade, whether it's here or in the United States or even in West Africa. And Madge pointed to some of these issues a moment ago. And these relate to the notions of history and heritage, two very fraught and complicated ideas. They're at the very heart of what it is that we're talking about today. When we talk about history and we talk about heritage, I think we're actually conflating very complex, multifaceted notions. When we talk about history, for example, most of us refer to history as the past, the study of the past. Right? For me, where I come from, the past is a huge, unbounded period of time. The past is everything that happened before now. History is a disciplinary practice that picks and chooses what it is about the past we are going to talk about as a civilization, right? And history is shaped, the way we do history, the way we present history, it's shaped by a whole number of different issues. The kinds of archives we have, what's preserved, where it's preserved, who has access to it. That could be documentary archives or archaeological archives, what's out there to look at. But it also involves a lot of choice. It involves a lot of choice about what we agree on as good history, what makes acceptable history to write about. From an archaeological perspective, my field of expertise, the same thing can be said about heritage. Heritage is to culture what history is to past. Human culture is all that complex suite of ideas, values, likes, dislikes, ways of making a living in the world, right? Heritage are the things we pick and choose from our culture, from our shared suite of cultural traits to present as the best of who we are. Right? So whether it's an institution like the British Museum or the Smithsonian on my home turf, right? These institutions, these museums are organized to catalog, to describe, and to present the best of who we are as a civilization. So history and heritage, essentially what we're talking about tonight, the history and heritage of slavery, these are intertwined in a very complex political project, one designed to tell a certain history and ignore other histories. The late Haitian historian and anthropologist, Michel Rolfe-Triot, once argued that the process of writing history is as much about silencing and forgetting as it is about giving voice to and memorializing the people of the past. And I think that's exactly what we're talking about today. Tonight we're cutting across the grain of traditional history and heritage studies to seek ways of talking about the heritage of slavery, an institution that many would choose to forget. Okay? So most of us have some semblance of how the transatlantic slave trade was organized. Just very briefly, this is a public audience, so we can talk in very loose terms, right? The period that we're talking about from the 16th through the 19th century, the Atlantic era, or the period of the triangular trade, we're talking about an era when manufacturers produced right around the corner, right up the road from where we're sitting tonight, were shipped to West Africa, used to purchase human beings who were sent to the Caribbean, or to plantations in the American South or to Latin America to work to produce raw materials, which were then shipped back to Europe to produce those same manufactures. So it was a global trade that involved communities on every corner of the Atlantic world: Europe, North America, the Caribbean, South America, and Western Africa. This was a global trade that started in the 16th century, but really peaked in the 17th century, when the plantation economies of the New World really took off to produce tobacco, sugar, indigo, cotton, other products, which were again brought back to Europe to satisfy an insatiable demand for these sorts of products. This trade that we're talking about tonight resulted in our current historic, our conservative estimates now, resulted in the forced migration of 12.5 million people. Right? Now that's our conservative estimate. That's our best guess right now. Undoubtedly, it was much higher. Undoubtedly, millions of more people died en route to coastal ports. And of course, millions of people who got on those slave ships never got off. Not to mention the horrors of slavery and slave life once they arrived in the New World. Now, the effects of this massive movement of people from West Africa to the New World, the long-term demographic effects of this mass migration are undeniable. One of the things that historians and anthropologists and archaeologists, all of us studying West Africa, have asked for quite some time is, given the long-term debilitating effects of the slave trade on West African societies, why in fact did some African groups engage in the slave trade? It's been a legitimate conundrum that many of us have sought to work out. The obvious answer, of course, is that many of the goods that were produced in places like Bristol, Liverpool, elsewhere, were in hot demand in sub-Saharan Africa. And we're only now beginning to tease out exactly what role those goods played in West African society. We used to think that they were flooding across the continent, displacing local industries. We know that's not the case anymore. Some of these goods, such as guns, gunpowder, were clearly implicated in the military conflicts used to capture slaves for the export trade. Other goods, such as brass goods produced right here, or beads, or distilled alcoholic beverages, these were used as currencies, so they fit right into local economies. Other goods played more symbolic roles. Things like textiles, pottery, other manufactures were in hot demand by an emerging elite class, merchants and kings of West Africa, and they used them to show off their status in very traditional ways. So one of the things that I think is interesting to highlight about the way in which production here articulated with the slave trading economies of West Africa in the 17th and 18th centuries is that you have analogous things going on, just as the grand Georgian manors of Bristol are getting thrown up by wealthy merchants and plantation owners. You have elites in West Africa building royal palaces, right? Establishing new urban communities. And so interesting analogous things are happening on both sides of the Atlantic. I'm not going to go on too much more about this. I think some of the issues will come out in the discussion. But one of the things that we've tended to focus on historically is that Europe and Africa were involved in some sort of complex trading relationship. I think one of the things we can all collectively agree upon now is that we've ignored the role of class, and that it was really rich, wealthy Europeans and rich, wealthy Africans that were coordinating in the most despicable trade in human history. And so we can't forget that. There are just as many Colston types in West Africa as there were in Western Europe.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Okay, thanks.